Can Jim Garrison prove his increasingly complicated and far-flung case? Until that case is brought to court before a jury, until the evidence is presented, no one can say. On May 12th, Garrison announced he had discovered a code, the same numbers and notebooks of Oswald and Shaw, which, decoded, was Jack Ruby's private telephone numbers. A WDSU reporter asked Garrison to explain the code.
Mr. Garrison, in Lee Harvey Oswald's diary, the Warren report says the number in there is DD19106. However, you say it's PO. How do you determine that it's PO, sir?
Well, it's just more or less by looking at it.
Well, do you still think that the number in Lee Harvey Oswald's notebook was Jack Ruby's phone number?
If I thought it possible to communicate with you, I'd answer it, but I don't think there's any way.
Well, Mr. Garrison, if the P.O. box didn't exist until late '65, how could it then be Jack Ruby's phone number?
Well, that's a problem for you to think over because you obviously missed the point.
That's Jim Garrison in June 1967, talking about his latest hot lead in the Kennedy case. In March, Garrison's prime suspect in the case, Clay Shaw, had faced a pre-trial hearing in front of a panel of 3 judges, and the judges had ruled that there was probable cause for Shaw to stand trial on charges of conspiracy. It still wasn't clear when that trial would actually happen, and as it turned out, it wouldn't begin until January 1969, which was still 18 months away. For the moment, Jim Garrison was on the lookout for any evidence, no matter how thin it was, that could link Clay Shaw with either Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby. And now Garrison was claiming to have discovered evidence that linked Shaw with both Oswald and Ruby. This evidence was contained in Clay Shaw's address book, which Garrison had seized when he'd arrested him. Garrison had found an entry in Shaw's book for a man named Lee Odom, spelt O-D-O-M. The address that Shaw had written down for this Lee Odom person was P.O. Box 19106, Dallas, Texas. According to Garrison, there was a page in Lee Harvey Oswald's address book where Oswald had written down exactly the same post office box number. That sounded exciting enough in itself, but Garrison had more. He told reporters that this post office box number was a fake. There was no such real post office box in Dallas at all. That meant that the number in Shaw and Oswald's notebooks had to be some kind of code, and Garrison claimed to have broken that code. He said that when you deciphered the number in Shaw and Oswald's address books, you found that it was an encoded version of Jack Ruby's unlisted telephone number. If this was true, Jim Garrison had made a sensational breakthrough in the Kennedy case and in his conspiracy case against Clay Shaw. But notice that I began that sentence with the phrase, if this was true. When you're dealing with Jim Garrison, you have to begin more or less every sentence with that phrase, because by this point in the case, it had become clear that nothing Garrison said about Kennedy's murder could be taken at face value, because everything that he'd said about it so far, literally everything, had turned out not to be true. His claim about the code in Oswald and Shaw's address book would turn out to be no different. The code Garrison claimed to have discovered was bogus. It just wasn't real. But the story of Garrison's code is well worth telling for several reasons. For one thing, it demonstrates how incredibly cartoonish and Clouseau-esque Garrison's investigation had become by this point. Also, Garrison's code sparked off a bitter civil war among the big-name conspiracy theorists who had come down to New Orleans to help him with his investigation. Generally speaking, conspiracy theorists love the idea of secret codes. They can't get enough of them. But Garrison's theory about the telephone code divided the early Kennedy conspiracy theorists. Some of them believed his theory, but for others, Garrison's code was a deal-breaker. Friendships in the conspiracy community fell apart over the issue of Garrison's code. There were prominent conspiracy theorists who never spoke to each other again because of it. As I tell the story of Garrison's code in this episode, we're going to see yet again that not all conspiracy theorists are the same. They come in different shapes and sizes, and some of them are more sane and decent than others. For the early Kennedy conspiracy theorists, Garrison's code became a kind of ethical and intellectual acid test. Some of Garrison's followers simply couldn't bring themselves to disbelieve his code idea. Others saw straight away that it was bogus, and they bravely tried to blow the whistle about it in public. Others knew that Garrison was talking rubbish, but made a tactical decision to stay quiet about that because they thought that the ends justified the means and that it was fine for Garrison to use bad arguments as long as he was using them in a good cause. And then there was Garrison himself, who was both so grossly unethical and so grossly delusional that it's still hard even today to say for sure if he knew that his code theory was a joke and didn't care, or if he was so far gone that he really believed it. My name is David Free, and this is The Ghosts of Dallas. The story of Jim Garrison's telephone code had its roots in a meeting that took place in New York on March the 10th, 1967. Garrison had arrested Clay Shaw 9 days earlier on March the 1st. Shaw's pre-trial hearing would begin 4 days later on the 14th. Garrison had made international headlines when he arrested Shaw. He'd announced that he had positively solved the assassination of President Kennedy, and reporters from all over America and the world were flocking to New Orleans to find out if that claim was true. In Manhattan, William Shawn, the editor of The New Yorker, decided that he needed somebody to cover the story for the magazine, so he called on Edward Epstein, the author of the best-selling 1966 book Inquest. Epstein's book was the most substantial of those early Kennedy conspiracy books, and Epstein certainly had some impressive qualifications. He had a master's degree in political science from Cornell University, and he was now studying for his doctorate at Harvard. When William Shawn called Epstein into the New Yorker offices, he said to him, "Mr. Epstein, could a local district attorney have solved a mystery that defied the Warren Commission?" Edward Epstein told him that he didn't think that was impossible. So in mid-April, a month after Clay Shaw's preliminary hearing, Epstein flew down to New Orleans to try to answer that question for The New Yorker. He was accompanied by a research assistant named Jones Harris, who was a keen amateur student of the assassination. Jim Garrison gave Epstein and Harris a warm welcome. He took Epstein to dinner at his favourite restaurant, Broussard's, and he told him that he was a big fan of his book. In fact, he said that reading it had been a major factor in making him decide to launch his investigation in New Orleans. He also told Epstein that he'd just had a major breakthrough in the case. But when Epstein asked him what that breakthrough was, Garrison seemed strangely reluctant to tell him. Instead, he told Epstein that if he came to the DA's office the next morning, he could check out the evidence for himself. So at 10 a.m. the next day, Epstein and Jones Harris turned up at Garrison's office. Garrison himself wasn't there to greet them. They were greeted by one of his assistants, who showed them into a room with 6 cardboard boxes in it. These boxes contained the evidence that Garrison had seized from Clay Shaw's house after his arrest. Garrison's assistant explained that nobody in the office had had time to go through these boxes yet, but if Epstein and Harris cared to go through them themselves, they could then let Garrison know if they found anything interesting in them. Edward Epstein found this proposition odd for several reasons. For a start, as he put it later, it seemed curious that Clay Shaw's papers had not already been rigorously scrutinised by Garrison or his staff. 6 weeks earlier, when Garrison had arrested Shaw, he'd told people that one of the main reasons why he'd felt compelled to make the sudden arrest was that he wanted to stop Shaw from destroying important personal papers that might be key to the case. But now Garrison had had those papers for 6 weeks, and he hadn't even bothered to go through them. As Epstein wrote later, 6 weeks had passed, and yet from what I saw, it seemed that no investigation of Clay Shaw was going on at all. On top of that point, Epstein wondered if it was even legal for him and Jones Harris to be rummaging through Clay Shaw's belongings. He knew that a local judge had ruled that Garrison was not permitted to discuss or disclose any of the evidence related to the case. As Epstein wrote later, the very fact that Harris and I were allowed to examine objects seized from Shaw's home seemed to be a direct violation of that court order. Why, I wondered, should the district attorney risk having his case thrown out of court on a technicality by letting outsiders go freely through the evidence? Mind you, now that Garrison had offered him the chance to go through the evidence, Epstein was hardly going to turn him down. So he and Jones Harris sat alone with the cardboard boxes for 2 hours and went through their contents. As Harris was going through one of the boxes, he found Clay Shaw's address book, and as he flipped through the book, he came across that entry for Lee Odom with the Dallas Post Office box number 19106. Jones Harris was familiar with all the major assassination documents that had been published by the Warren Commission, and he also apparently had a photographic memory, because as soon as he saw the entry for Lee Odom in Shaw's notebook, he recalled that there was a page in Oswald's notebook where Oswald had written down the same 5-digit number, 19106. In Oswald's notebook, though, there was no indication that this number was a post office box number. In Oswald's notebook, the number had been preceded by 2 letters that were written in Cyrillic script, that is, in Russian, presumably because Oswald had written this entry in his book while he was living in the USSR. The letters Oswald had written were both the same. They both represented the Russian letter Da, which is the equivalent of our letter D. I'll put a link to an image of this page from Oswald's notebook in the show notes. And if you look at the image, you'll see that the Cyrillic character Da does look a bit like the English letter P. So the complete entry in Oswald's notebook does look as if it says PP 19106, but in fact it should be read as DD 19106. Oswald hadn't written down a name or any other information beside this sequence of letters and numbers, so what it meant to him was not clear. Jones Harris was aware of all this when he came across the entry for Lee Odom in Clay Shaw's notebook, so when he noticed that Odom's post office box number happened to match the 5-digit number that Oswald had written in his book after the Russian letters DD, Harris was intrigued but not overly excited. He and Edward Epstein agreed that the repetition of the 5-digit number was a striking coincidence, but they also agreed that it proved nothing in itself. When they pointed out this coincidence to Jim Garrison, though, Garrison instantly decided that it had to be more than just a coincidence. People like Garrison don't believe in coincidences, or rather they don't believe that anything is ever just a coincidence. And you can see why the entry in Clay Shaw's notebook would have looked quite tantalising to somebody who was as desperate for evidence as Garrison currently was. First of all, you had the name, Lee Odom. You can see how someone as excitable as Garrison would have got at least half a Rodney from the fact that this Odom character had the same first name as Oswald and had a surname that started with the same letter. Then you had the 5-digit number, which was exactly the same in both books. The only hurdle for Garrison was that the entry in Shaw's book was clearly marked as a post office box number, whereas the entry in Oswald's book wasn't. In Oswald's book, the number wasn't preceded by the letters PO, let alone by the phrase PO Box. It was preceded by those 2 Cyrillic Ds. But hurdles like that were hardly going to stop a man with an imagination as vivid as Garrison's. The way he saw it, or at least the way he said he saw it, the letters that Oswald had written in his book were the letters PO. And as I've said, the first of Oswald's Cyrillic Ds did look a bit like a P if you squinted at it hard enough, but to believe that the second letter looked like an O, you effectively needed to be Jim Garrison, because I don't know of anybody else in the world, apart from Garrison, who's ever said that this letter does look like an O. The morning after Harris and Epstein found the entry in Shaw's notebook, Garrison had breakfast with Epstein, and he told him that their discovery had led him to a major new breakthrough in the case. Garrison already seemed to have forgotten about the other breakthrough that he'd promised to tell Epstein about the previous day. Whatever that breakthrough had been, it seemed that the notebook development had blown it out of the water. Garrison told Epstein that Shaw's notebook entry didn't just positively link Shaw to Oswald, it also linked both of them to Jack Ruby. When Epstein asked Garrison what he was talking about, Garrison explained that PO 19106 was really a code, and that he'd already managed to crack the code. He told Epstein that when you decrypted the sequence PO 19106, you ended up with Jack Ruby's unlisted Dallas phone number, which was WH15601. When Epstein asked Garrison to explain exactly how Shaw and Oswald's coding system had worked, Garrison replied that it was, quote, subjective. That word rang alarm bells for Edward Epstein. In other words, he wrote later, Garrison had used hocus pocus to connect Shaw to Oswald and Ruby, while he still avoided answering my questions about the new evidence that he had told me about on the phone. Epstein flew back home to Boston after that meeting with Garrison, and he would fly back and forth to New Orleans several times over the next year as he worked on his New Yorker story about Garrison, which wouldn't end up appearing until July 1968. After that conversation with Garrison over breakfast, the next thing Epstein heard about the alleged code was when he opened a newspaper a month later, in May, and read that Garrison had now gone public with his theory.
On May 12th, Garrison announced he had discovered a code, the same numbers and notebooks of Oswald and Shaw, which, decoded, was Jack Ruby's private telephone numbers.
When Garrison went public with his idea of the code, he told reporters that the entries in Shaw and Oswald's notebook were identical, which Edward Epstein knew simply was not true. Garrison also claimed that Oswald's notebook had a lot of other coded entries in it, which he'd also successfully decoded using the same system. Garrison said, quote, Oswald invariably uses the dial of the telephone as conversion machinery to convert letters into numbers and back again. He systematically adds the number values, resulting in a sum which can later be broken down into the real exchange listing. According to Garrison, when you decoded the sequence PO 19106 using Oswald's system, you ended up with Jack Ruby's unlisted telephone number and, quote, no other number on Earth. To prove his claim that PO 19106 was some kind of code, Garrison told reporters that there was no such post office box in Dallas as PO Box 19106, and there never had been. It was a, quote, non-existent or fictional number, Garrison said, and this, as he put it, removed the possibility of coincidence. That last point did sound like a pretty good one, but once again we have to throw in the qualification that we always have to throw in with Garrison. It was only a good point if it was true, and it soon emerged that it wasn't. Not long after Edward Epstein saw Garrison's announcement about the code in the newspapers, he got a tip from a contact that he'd made in Garrison's office, a guy named Thomas Bethel. Bethel rang Epstein up on the sly, and he told him the embarrassing truth. Garrison's staff had now established that P.O. Box 19106 was indeed a real Dallas post office box number, and there really was a guy in Dallas named Lee Odom who had access to this post office box. Back in 1966, Lee Odom had gone to New Orleans on a business trip, and he'd briefly met Clay Shaw during that trip, and that was why Shaw had written down Odom's name and post office box number in his notebook. That was bad news for Jim Garrison, and the news got worse because his staff had also discovered that Post Office Box 19106 had not come into existence in Dallas until 1965. By that point, Oswald had, of course, been dead for about 2 years, so whatever the number 19106 had referred to in his notebook, it must have referred to something other than the Dallas Post Office Box. Nobody has ever been able to work out, by the way, what the sequence of letters and numbers in Oswald's book did refer to, but the point that matters here is that it quite clearly couldn't have referred to the Dallas post office box that Clay Shaw's notebook entry clearly did refer to. The coincidence was just a coincidence. Even Garrison seemed to understand that now, because when his staff made these discoveries about Lee Odom and the post office box, Garrison sternly ordered them not to mention these discoveries to anybody outside the office. Thomas Bethel was violating that order when he rang up Edward Epstein to tell him all this, so Epstein agreed to keep their conversation off the record. Meanwhile, after ordering his staff not to talk about the post office box, Garrison himself continued to claim in public that the code he had discovered was real. That was pretty reckless behaviour on his part, because what he was saying could easily be checked up on and disproved in several different ways. The Warren Commission had published a full facsimile of Oswald's notebook, which any reporter or member of the public could easily look at. And anybody with a pair of eyes was immediately going to see that Oswald's notebook entry did not say P.O. Box 19106, as Garrison had falsely claimed.
Mr. Garrison, in Lee Harvey Oswald's diary, the Warren report says the number in there is DD 19106. However, you say it's P.O. How do you determine that it's P.O., sir?
Well, it's just more or less by looking at it.
According to Garrison, you could see that Oswald had written the letters P.O. more or less by looking at them, but most people, when they looked at them, didn't see the letters P.O. It was also very easy to check up on Garrison's claim that there was no real post office box number 19106 in Dallas, and again that claim proved to be false when you did check it. Finally, it wasn't hard to establish that Lee Odom was a totally real guy, and that he really did live in Dallas. When reporters tracked Odom down in Dallas, he told them that he'd made a trip to New Orleans in 1966 when he was trying to interest local business leaders there in the idea of staging bullfights in the city. Odom had met with Clay Shaw during the course of that trip, and at the end of their meeting, he'd given Shaw the number of his post office box in Dallas. In fact, Odom even remembered having watched as Shaw wrote the number down in his notebook. Here's the real Lee Odom explaining all this to a reporter.
When I got to New Orleans, and I got there, it was late, and so I wanted to see what New Orleans, my first trip to New Orleans, and I went to Pat O'Brien's, and that's where I met Mr. Shaw. I was sitting drinking at the bar, and he was sitting next to me, and I got talking to him about if he thought a bullfight might go over good in New Orleans. So the next day, while we had lunch together and tried to find out about a place to have a bullfight. We didn't find any place, so when I got ready to leave there, I give him my name and my box number, which I saw him write in his little book, and I never heard from him after that. But that's how the number got in the book.
Of course, if the number in Clay Shaw's notebook was the real post office box number of a real guy that Clay Shaw really knew, that was game over for the idea that it was a code for some other number. Again, even Garrison himself seemed to grasp the logic of that point, or at least he had to start with, because to bolster his claim that the number was a code, he had told reporters that there was no such post office box. That fact had ruled out the possibility of coincidence, Garrison said. But that fact had turned out not to be a fact. When it emerged that the post office box did indeed exist, but hadn't existed until after Oswald was dead, that was a devastating double whammy for Garrison's code theory. It torpedoed the theory from two different angles. Unbelievably, though, Garrison still stubbornly refused to admit that the facts had proved him wrong.
Well, do you still think that the number in Lee Harvey Oswald's notebook was Jack Ruby's phone number?
If I thought it possible to communicate with you, I'd answer, but I don't think there's any way.
Well, Mr. Garrison, if the P.O. box didn't exist until late '65, how could it then be Jack Ruby's phone number?
Well, that's a problem for you to think over because you obviously missed the point.
So how did Garrison's supposed code work? I'm going to explain that in a moment, but before I do, I want to make it clear that just because it's possible to show that Garrison invented a decoding system that quote-unquote worked, in the sense that it successfully allowed him to transform a number that he didn't want into a number that he did want, that doesn't mean that his system was in any sense a real code. In fact, it can't possibly have been a real code. You don't have to know anything about how codes work to know that. You only have to have common sense. For example, we know for a fact that Jack Ruby's telephone number was not really unlisted, as Garrison claimed it was. In fact, Ruby's number was in the white pages, and common sense tells us that people don't tend to use elaborate coding systems to disguise phone numbers that they can just look up in a phone book. Also, if Garrison was right to say that Oswald and Shaw had encoded Jack Ruby's phone number using the same system, then the encoded versions of that number in their books would logically have had to be identical, not just similar, but identical. If the entries in their notebooks were not identical, that in itself was game over for the idea that they could somehow generate the same unique number when you decoded them. And as we've seen, the entries in their books were simply not identical. Oswald's entry featured 2 Cyrillic Ds, not the letters PO. I've said that you can confirm this for yourself if you want to by looking at the image of the page from Oswald's notebook, but really you don't have to do that, because when you think about it, the fact that there's any dispute at all about what those letters in Oswald's notebook are is enough by itself to sink the idea that Oswald was using a code. If Oswald had wanted to write down 2 letters that were really a code for 2 other letters, and if he knew that he would have to decode those letters every time he wanted to ring up Jack Ruby to shoot the breeze about assassinating Kennedy, then he obviously would have been very careful to write down a P that looked exactly like a P and no other letter, and an O that looked exactly like an O and no other letter. He sure as hell wouldn't have fucked around writing 2 letters that could easily be mistaken for Cyrillic Ds, especially if he was living in Russia at the time that he wrote them. I don't deny that it was quite a coincidence that the number Oswald wrote after those letters, 19106, later turned up in the address book of a man who had just been charged with conspiring with Oswald to kill Kennedy. But the facts say that the coincidence was just a coincidence. And Garrison's problem was that he was just never able to accept that. The moment he saw that 5-digit number in Shaw's book, all the blood in his brain rushed straight to his Johnson, and he never stopped to remind himself that there's a massive difference between noticing that the 2 notebook entries were similar and claiming that they were absolutely identical. Garrison was still making that false claim 20 years later in 1988 when he published his book On the Trail of the Assassins, which Oliver Stone used as the basis of his movie JFK. Garrison wrote in that book, "The citation of PO 19106 appeared in Lee Oswald's address book as well as Shaw's." But even as he wrote that, Garrison seemed to know at some level that it wasn't true, because just a couple of pages later in the same book, you find him writing that, quote, virtually the same phrase, PO 19106, was memorialized forever on one of the pages of Oswald's address book. So even in the pages of his own book, Garrison couldn't be bothered to get his story about the notebook entries straight. He couldn't decide whether they were exactly the same or just virtually the same. You could hardly ask for a better illustration of how chaotically slapdash Garrison's attitude to hard evidence was. And you could hardly ask for a better illustration of his chronic inability to just pick one story and stick to it. Believe it or not, there are still thousands of people online today who believe that Garrison was some kind of brave, truth-telling sage and prophet. If you doubt that that could possibly be true, just take a look at the comments under any YouTube video of Garrison. There really are tens of thousands of people out there who continue to believe that Jim Garrison cracked the Kennedy case. But it must be quite a frustrating experience to be a disciple of Garrison's, because how exactly do you go about defending a man who was so sloppy and careless that he couldn't even be bothered to be consistent, even when writing his own life story? That was how pure Garrison's contempt for reality was. His various claims about the assassination didn't even line up with each other, let alone with reality. They kept changing over time. And when you're talking about an alleged code, you really do have to be precise. Sloppiness and vagueness are not an option. The entries in Shaw and Oswald's notebooks could not have been both exactly the same and virtually the same. They were either exactly the same or they were not. And if they were not, if they were only virtually the same, as Garrison himself was ready to admit in certain moods, then the idea that they could somehow produce the same unique number when they were decoded goes out the window. So Garrison's code was not a real code. Once we grasp that, we're in a better position to understand what it was. It was an imaginary code. It was a code that Garrison had made up on the fly to get the result that he wanted. Somehow he needed to get from Lee Odom's post office box number to Jack Ruby's telephone number. He needed to get from PO 19106 to WH 15601. So how was he going to turn that first number into the second one? Patricia Lambert, in her book about the case, False Witness, says that Garrison tried on evidence the way he tried on clothes. He would just cast aside all the stuff that didn't suit him and he would keep on looking until he found something that did. This was certainly the approach that he used to invent his telephone code. He tried out a whole bunch of different methods to get from that first number to the second one, and sooner or later he was bound to find one that got him there, even if the system that he came up with didn't resemble any coding system previously known to man. Garrison had to deal with two separate challenges as he tried to get from PO 19106 to WH 15601. He somehow had to convert the letters PO into the letters WH, and he had to convert the number 19106 into the number 15601. Let's leave the letters aside for a moment, and let's look at how Garrison got from 19106 to 15601. If you put yourself in his shoes, you can see that the two numbers do look temptingly similar. 19106 and 15601. Both numbers have two ones in them, 10 and 16. And Garrison found that if you shuffled around the digits of that first number, 19106, you could turn it into the number 16901, which is even closer to 15601. In fact, to get from 16901 to 15601, all you have to do is subtract the number 1300. And that, according to Garrison, was the code. That was the method of encryption that Oswald and Shaw had used to hide the last 5 digits of Ruby's phone number. They'd added the number 1300 to his number, and then they'd shuffled around the digits. So to get back to Ruby's phone number, all you had to do was unshuffle the digits and then subtract the number 1300, and before you knew it, you could be on the blower to Jack Ruby. It hardly needs to be said that that is not how a real code works. Real codes work according to a system that is hard for outsiders to crack, but easy for the people who know the code to remember and use. The coding system proposed by Garrison is quite hard to understand and memorize, and the subtraction of the number 1300 at the end looks like a suspiciously redundant and arbitrary extra step. If Oswald and Shaw had really wanted to encipher Jack Ruby's phone number, it would have been enough for them to just scramble the digits of it according to a prearranged formula and be done with it. Why would they have then given themselves the extra task of subtracting the number 1300? The answer, of course, is that they wouldn't have. The subtraction of the number 1300 was a completely arbitrary step that Garrison had been forced to tack on at the end, because even after some pretty vigorous scrambling of digits, the best he could do was arrive at a number that was 1,300 more than the number he wanted. If he'd arrived at a number that was 1,400 more than the number he wanted, he would have said that their code required the subtraction of the number 1,400. It's like me telling you that the word dog is a perfect anagram of the word old. All you need to do is scramble the digits around. And then, of course, you have to replace the G with an L. Also, we do need to remind ourselves at this point that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't just dyslexic. He was also well known to be such a mathematical dumbo that he couldn't add 20 and 20 together without using a pencil and a piece of paper. The idea that Oswald could have memorized and used the code proposed by Jim Garrison was an absolute fantasy. And that's just the second part of Garrison's code. I haven't explained the part yet involving the letter prefixes. Fortunately, this part of Garrison's code is easier to explain and understand than the number part. Remember that Garrison's job here was to transform the letters PO into the letters WH. To do this, he looked to the letter-number combinations that you see on an old-fashioned telephone dial. The number 2 has the letters ABC on it, and so on. And when you look for the numbers P and O, you find that the P is on the 7 and the O is on the 6. 7 and 6 add up to 13. And according to Garrison, there were only 2 other numbers on the telephone dial that also added up to 13, namely 9 and 4. The 9 has a W on it, and the 4 has an H on it. Hence, according to Garrison, PO is an encryption of WH. This particular claim of Garrison's had several massive things wrong with it. For a start, he wasn't even correct to say that there were only 2 combinations on a telephone dial, 6 and 7 and 9 and 4, that added up to 13. He completely forgot about 8 and 5, which also add up to 13. Or if he didn't forget that, he imagined that all his critics would be too dumb to remember it. Again, this was how incredibly slapdash Garrison could be when he was in the grip of his latest theory. His ability to just ignore facts that didn't fit with his theories could be truly creepy. But even if you leave that huge mistake to one side, there's another hole in Garrison's theory that's equally embarrassing. Most of the numbers on a phone dial, of course, have 3 letters of the alphabet associated with them, not just 1. The number 9 doesn't just have a W on top of it, it also has an X and a Y. And the number 4 doesn't just have an H on it, it also has a G and an I. So if you use Garrison's method to try to decode the letters PO, you find that they don't have to be decoded as WH, they can just as easily be decoded as WG or WI or XH or YH and so on. Again, then, it becomes crystal clear that we're not dealing with a real code, because the whole point of a real code is that it can only deliver a single solution. Garrison's so-called code was a farce, and there's actually no way to explain how it worked without sounding a little bit insane. Unfortunately, I can't find any audio of Garrison himself explaining his code, but I can play you a hilarious clip in which a friend and ally of Garrison's, Senator Russell Long of Louisiana, valiantly went on TV and tried to explain how Garrison's code worked.
So that you take the P and the O and you use a telephone dial. P gives you 7, O gives you 6. So you add 7 and 6 together, you get 13. Then you take the 19106 and you work on the A, B, C, D, E, F, the A, B, C, D, E basis. So you put A comes ahead of E. Then you put D behind C. And you reconstruct the numbers and then you subtract 1300, which you got from the PO. And that gives you Ruby's unlisted telephone number.
Russell Long sounded like quite a clown as he tried to explain how Garrison's code worked, but that wasn't really his fault because Garrison's code didn't work, and there's no sane way to explain how it did. I've talked about Garrison's Code in such detail, not because there's any need these days to disprove it. The idea was so silly that essentially it disproved itself. But that's exactly why I think it is worth discussing Garrison's Code, precisely because it was so silly. I really do want to emphasise in this episode how flimsy and childish the arguments were that Garrison was using to destroy the life of the innocent Clay Shaw. Garrison was living in a cartoon world, and it was a badly drawn cartoon world at that. But everybody else was living in the real world, and Garrison's cartoon actions were having real flesh and blood consequences in that world. We should never forget that at the centre of this whole grotesque farce, there was a real human victim whose life and reputation were never going to be the same after what Garrison did to him.
Were you at that time, or have you ever been in David Ferry's apartment?
Never.
You've heard of the name Clay Bertrand.
I have.
Do you know any such person?
I do not.
Can you state whether or not you are Clay Bertrand?
I am not Clay Bertrand.
In 1963, did you ever have occasion to meet or know Lee Harvey Oswald?
Never.
Did you ever have occasion to meet or know David W. Ferry?
I did not.
Do you have any knowledge of a plot to assassinate President Kennedy?
None whatsoever.
Another reason I think Garrison's Code is worth lingering on is that when conspiracy theorists start talking about codes, they wander into the territory of mathematics, and that's a grave mistake on their part, because in the field of mathematics, you simply can't get away with making claims that are not true. Mathematical claims are either right or they're wrong. They can be tested objectively, and they can be shown to be either 100% correct or 100% false. Most of the time, conspiracy theories can't be put to that kind of objectively rigorous test, because most of the time the claims that conspiracy theorists make are claims about the human world, which is a lot more messy and uncertain than the world of numbers. When conspiracy theorists make claims about the human world, those claims may strike us as obvious garbage, but it's rarely possible to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that what they're saying is objectively untrue. In other words, most of the time, the claims that conspiracy theorists make are what philosophers and scientists call unfalsifiable claims. This is the great secret and superpower of conspiracy theories. It's why they're so difficult to kill off. When Jim Garrison claimed, for example, that the letters in Oswald's notebook looked to him like the letters P.O., there was no way you could prove that he didn't really think that. And when he alleged that Clay Shaw had met with Oswald and Ferry in Ferry's apartment, it was technically impossible to prove that that never happened. You could say that the evidence that Garrison produced for this claim was laughable and that his witnesses were pathetically obvious liars, but in the end you couldn't mathematically demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that Clay Shaw did not at some point meet and conspire with Oswald and Ferry. But when Garrison claimed that Oswald and Shaw had used the same code in their notebooks, he was making a mathematical claim, and that claim was demonstrably false. There were no ifs and buts about it. A mathematician could prove it with a pencil and a piece of paper. An expert cryptographer who was interviewed about Garrison's Code at the time on a TV report gently but firmly pointed out that Garrison's Code couldn't be a real code because the results it produced were, quote, not unique.
You've examined the numbers found in the notebooks of Lee Oswald and Clay Shaw by Jim Garrison's office, have you not?
Yes, I have.
And you've seen the explanation given by Mr. Garrison that they are a code for Jack Ruby's private telephone number?
Yes, I have.
Have you ever seen an encipherment like this before?
No, I certainly have not. In particular, the reaching of the prefix WH from a prefix PO is not even unique.
What do you mean by not even unique?
I mean that the fact that the sum of the corresponding digits to the letters in the prefix
being 13 does not give only one prefix back when you go to decipher what you have previously enciphered.
It could give any number then.
It could give, in this case, I believe, 6 such prefixes.
I see. So it could be any one of 6 prefixes, and he has arbitrarily selected one which fitted into that.
Essentially, that is what he has done.
In other words, if you have the answer to begin with, you can find a code which works.
Exactly.
By the way, although I'm not a cryptographer myself, I'm pretty sure that this guy's calculations were not quite right. By my count, there are not just 6 possible prefixes that you can arrive at by using Garrison's code. I think there are, in fact, 18. I think you can get 9 possibilities by using the 9 and the 4 on the telephone dial, and 9 more possibilities using the 8 and the 5. But in any case, the exact number of possible prefixes that you can get by using the code is a side issue. The only point that matters is that you can arrive at more than just one, which means that Garrison's alleged code was a crock of shit. As the cryptographer just said, the bottom line on Garrison's code is that if you have the answer you want to begin with, you can then always invent a code that will seem to work. In fact, that was the bottom line on Garrison's whole investigation. He began with the answers that he wanted, and then he went looking for arguments and evidence that would justify those answers, no matter how ridiculous those arguments were. In fact, you could go even further and say that this is the bottom line with all conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theory is that style of thought that starts out with a bogus conclusion of conspiracy and then finds bogus arguments to support that conclusion. Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw was a textbook case of conspiracy theory in action, right down to the obsession with secret codes, which have always been a central theme of conspiracy theory. For example, people who believe that Shakespeare's plays were not really written by Shakespeare will tell you that the plays are full of ingeniously coded lines that point to the author's true identity. In the 1890s, a mad doctor from Detroit named Orville Owen became convinced that Shakespeare's plays had really been written by the English philosopher Francis Bacon. To prove it, Owen made a large machine that he called a cipher wheel. He got 2 big rotating wheels, and he set them side by side, and he glued pages from Shakespeare's collected works to them, and then he rotated the wheels in various patterns and ways to uncover the self-referential clues that Francis Bacon had scattered throughout the works. For conspiracy theorists, the real world is never enough. It's just a coded version of the realer world underneath. Even the collected works of William Shakespeare are not enough. They have to have been written by someone even more clever and talented than Shakespeare, someone who, in addition to composing the greatest poetry ever written in English, also went to the trouble of throwing in a garnish of clever clues about his true identity, or maybe her true identity if you think that the plays were really written by Queen Elizabeth I. Of course, it isn't hard to work out why conspiracy theorists always have had to rely so heavily on the idea of codes. It's because they insist on believing things that are not true, things, that is, that are not supported by the evidence as it stands. This means that they then have to believe that the evidence as it stands has somehow been manipulated or faked by some ingenious group of unseen conspirators, and it can only be understood and decoded by the only people in the world who are even cleverer than those conspirators, namely the conspiracy theorists themselves. There is, of course, something very self-important about this idea. Conspiracy theorists always like to believe that they're the stars of their own personal Truman shows. All the world's scenery has been arranged so as to pull the wool over their eyes personally. But thankfully, they alone are smart enough to crack the code. The truth can stay hidden for years or even centuries until some towering sage like Russell Brand comes along to reveal the hidden truth that everybody else before him has been too dumb or docile to notice. There was certainly something very self-important about Jim Garrison's belief that he'd cracked the secret codes in Oswald's notebook. Before Garrison came along, thousands of very diligent professional and amateur researchers had pored over every page of Oswald's notebook for almost 3 years, trying to work out what each entry in it meant and whether any of those entries contained any hints or clues about the assassination. But somehow, all of those diligent researchers had managed to overlook the code that Garrison found in the notebook by poring over it for just one night. Somebody asked Garrison once why Oswald would have bothered to encipher phone numbers that he could easily have looked up in the white pages, and Garrison's reply was that Oswald just enjoyed playing cops and robbers. In truth, though, it was actually Garrison who liked playing cops and robbers. He wasn't just constantly claiming to have discovered new things about the Kennedy case that nobody before him had ever noticed. He also claimed that as a result of his work on the case, he had invented radical new ways of getting at the truth in general. In his opinion, the Kennedy case was much too special to be solved using old-fashioned methods of inquiry like collecting physical evidence and letting the evidence speak for itself. The case could only be cracked by using special methods of detection invented by Garrison himself. This sounds like obvious snake oil, but Garrison never bothered to hide his crackpot belief that this is what he was doing. In fact, he even once put it in writing. He wrote that the Kennedy assassination had been, quote, a professionally clandestine operation, which meant that the conspirators were too smart to be caught by using, quote, traditional evidence such as fingerprints, footprints, confessions, and so on. According to Garrison, the case could only be solved by, quote, the successive application of models until one finds one which fits. Earlier on, I quoted Patricia Lambert saying that Garrison tried on evidence the way other people tried on clothes. She meant that as a criticism, but here was Garrison himself seeming to think that there was nothing wrong with admitting that this is exactly what he was doing. He wasn't unearthing any new evidence. He was reinterpreting the old evidence by looking at it through a series of different lenses or models until he found one that suddenly worked, or at least worked according to him. Garrison had fallen very deeply into a trap that all Kennedy conspiracy theorists fall into to one extent or another. They all behave as if the Kennedy assassination was somehow not a normal event in the real world, which you could understand using the regular parts of your brain, but a kind of otherworldly event that can only be understood if you reject and move past the obvious explanations that are staring you right in the face. For Jim Garrison, the Kennedy case was so magical that he believed that he had to invent whole new ways of seeing to deal with it. The telephone code wasn't the only so-called model that Garrison invented to make the evidence in the case look more like what he wanted it to look like. There was also his theory of propinquity, which I talked about in the previous episode. Then there was his idea that using truth serum and hypnosis on his witnesses was a way of, quote, objectifying their testimony. That is, a way of somehow making their testimony more scientifically reliable than the testimony of people who hadn't been drugged or hypnotized. Garrison did honestly seem to believe that he'd come up with new ways of establishing the truth that no one had ever thought of before. He really was that deluded. When Edward Epstein asked him how he had solved the alleged mystery of Kennedy's murder, Garrison said, quote, it's exactly like a chess problem. The Warren Commission moved the same pieces back and forth and got nowhere. I made a new move and solved the problem. Talking to another reporter, Garrison said, the truth is reached only when nearsighted fascination with mere detail is abandoned and events are looked at in perspective or in context. My favourite part of that quote is the phrase mere details. Garrison suffered from that dangerous delusion that it's possible to take shortcuts to the truth by skipping all the boring factual stuff and just using your imagination. If you're clever enough, if you're a grand master of detection like Jim Garrison, you don't have to worry about the mere details. You can simply use your third eye to understand the big hidden truth all at once in one blinding moment of clarity. Garrison was constantly claiming to have found new and better ways of looking at reality. But when he used those special ways of seeing, reality was not what he saw. What he saw was a world of pure imagination, a kind of projection of his own paranoid fantasies. Late in the 19th century, there was a brief craze among amateur mathematicians for squaring the circle. Professional mathematicians had declared that that feat was impossible, and so crackpot amateurs all over Europe set out to prove them wrong. They sat down with their pads and their pencils, and they wrote out their crackpot proofs. But of course they never did end up squaring the circle because that is by definition impossible. Jim Garrison was doing the same thing in the Kennedy case. He was the guy who thought he could finally square the assassination circle by making the ingenious chess move that nobody else in the world had ever thought of. When Garrison told Edward Epstein that he'd solved the assassination by making this special chess move, Epstein was sceptical. He grew more sceptical still over the course of the next year while he worked on his big New Yorker profile of Garrison. When his article finally appeared in July 1968, it became the latest in a series of scathing press exposés of Garrison. Later that same year, Epstein expanded his article into a book called Counterplot. The trial of Clay Shaw wouldn't begin until January 1969, so both Epstein's New Yorker article and his book came out while Garrison was still building his case and while he could still, in theory, be stopped. In his book, Epstein admitted that watching Garrison at work over the past year had caused him to ponder an important general question. He wrote, "Can the process of establishing the truth ever be separated from its end product, the truth?" For Epstein, the answer to that question was no. The methods that you use to find out what the truth is have to be beyond reproach. If your methods are shoddy, if you don't properly respect the little things that Garrison called mere details, then your final picture of what the truth is going to end up being dangerously warped. As Epstein pointed out, there really are no shortcuts to establishing the truth. The only way to get to the truth is the boring, old-fashioned way, by collecting and examining evidence and listening to eyewitness testimony and reading official records and documents. These things are the building blocks of our knowledge, but as Epstein pointed out, these building blocks aren't always reliable, and at worst they can be manipulated or even forged. So we have to be able to trust the people who collect and interpret these building blocks for us. And when a demagogue like Garrison comes along and chronically refuses to be honest and accurate about the evidence, then our whole sense of what the truth is can be poisoned. To quote Epstein, "If one has reason to doubt the process by which facts have been ascertained or confirmed, how can one ever be certain that they bear any relation to the truth, or even that the facts themselves are not outright fabrications? For data can be accepted as factual truth if and only if the probity of the investigator is also accepted. A demagogue who demonstrates a willingness to alter elements of the story when it serves his purpose may temporarily excite public opinion, but he can never establish his version of the truth as the truth." Fortunately, Epstein ended up being right about that last part. Garrison's fantasy version of the Kennedy assassination never did end up establishing itself as the truth. His demagoguery did excite public opinion for a while, and there are still some dark corners of the internet where people seem to believe that the guy was a genius. But out here in the real world, nothing Garrison said about the assassination, literally nothing, has ever managed to establish itself as a generally accepted truth. It's very important to remember that this criticism of Garrison was coming from Edward Epstein, the author of Inquest. It's not as if Epstein had any ideological problem with Garrison's basic position. His mind was totally open to the possibility of conspiracy. The reason Epstein blew the whistle on Garrison was purely because of the way Garrison was going about his business. Epstein was appalled by the contempt that Garrison had for basic intellectual norms. And Epstein wasn't the only big-name conspiratorial author who was turned off by Garrison's antics. Another big-name conspiracist who ended up turning against Garrison was Sylvia Meagher, author of the 1967 book Accessories After the Fact.
Do you think that Oswald's guilt and implication in this crime has or has not been amply demonstrated?
I think that the evidence clearly demonstrates that Oswald was entirely innocent of this crime, and indeed of the two other crimes charged to him, the murder of Tippit and the alleged attack on General Walker.
That's Sylvia Meagher talking on the radio in 1967, just after she'd published the book Accessories After the Fact, along with other leading members of the American conspiratorial community. Meagher had become aware of Garrison's activities in New Orleans at a very early stage, several months before the news of his investigation broke publicly. Late in 1966, Garrison's office had started reaching out to America's best-known assassination skeptics, including Meagher. Garrison wanted to have the conspiracy community on his side, and to start with, they all were. In fact, the whole community was buzzing with excitement. Here was this big-name public official who finally had the balls to reopen the whole case. Sylvia Meagher lived in New York, and when she heard about Garrison's investigation, she was tempted to jump on the first plane to New Orleans so that she could help him out in person. But unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Meagher was too busy at the time to do that. Unlike some of the other conspiracy theorists, she had a day job. She worked for the World Health Organization in New York. She was also busy finalizing the text of her book. So instead of joining the action in New Orleans, Meagher mailed Garrison a bunch of materials that she thought might be of help. She sent him a chapter from her unfinished book, and she also sent him a copy of an index to the Warren Report that she'd spent a year putting together. She enclosed a letter to Garrison in which she wrote, quote, "It is difficult for me to tell you, without lapsing into extravagant prose, how deeply grateful my colleagues among the critics and I personally feel for your enormous courage and independence in this case." Meagher finished her letter by quoting the phrase, "Let justice be done or the heavens fall." Garrison had used this phrase so often in public that it was already known as a kind of trademark of his. You may remember Kevin Costner as Garrison using this phrase in the movie JFK and sounding as if he really was passionately interested in the concept of justice. For the moment, Sylvia Meagher believed that Garrison was interested in justice, so their relationship got off to a pretty warm start. The first bump in the road for them came a couple of months later, when Meagher picked up a newspaper and read about Garrison's discovery of the telephone code. Meagher was alarmed by this story. She knew Oswald's notebook like the back of her hand, and she could see straight away that Garrison had made several embarrassing mistakes about it. So she sat down and wrote him an urgent letter to tell him where he'd gone wrong. She pointed out that the letters that Garrison had read as a P and an O were quite definitely two Cyrillic Ds. As proof of this, she told Garrison to check out another page in the notebook where Oswald had practiced writing out the Cyrillic alphabet, and when he'd come to the D, he had quite clearly written the same character that Garrison had managed to mistake for both a P and an O. Ma also urged Garrison to take a closer look at the other entries in Oswald's notebook that surrounded the entry he was so excited about. As Ma pointed out, all the other entries on that page had evidently been written while Oswald was living in the USSR, that is, at some point prior to his return to the United States in June 1962. Everything about those entries made this point clear, right down to the consistency of the ink. As Ma gently put it to Garrison, quote, "While it is plausible that Oswald might have recorded a cryptogram of Ruby's telephone number sometime in 1963, it is hard to believe that he would have done so during his time in the Soviet Union. Perhaps," Ma went on, "these points have already occurred to you and have been overcome. I take it for granted that, in any case, you would wish me to bring them to your attention." I have to admit that I've got a fair bit of time for Sylvia Ma. There's no doubt that she had some crazy beliefs about the Kennedy case, but she did have a basic respect for the integrity of the evidence. What I mean by that is that she wasn't the kind of person who would pretend that a piece of evidence was there when it really wasn't, or that it wasn't there when it really was. She wasn't the kind of person, for example, who would pretend that a letter was a P or an O when she really knew that it was a Russian D. And when she wrote that letter to Jim Garrison in the middle of May, she was still assuming that Garrison was that kind of person too. She assumed that he didn't already know that he was wrong, and that when she pointed out to him that he was, he would make haste to correct himself on the public record. Ma sent her letter to Garrison by registered airmail, special delivery, and she requested a return receipt. She didn't want there to be any doubt that Garrison would get her letter and that he would get it fast. The day after she sent it, Ma was at work, and she got a call from Garrison's secretary saying that Garrison wanted to speak with her. Ma later wrote, quote, "As I waited 2 or 3 minutes for Garrison to come on the line, I tried to steel myself for a possibly angry, hostile, or irritated reaction to my letter. But when Garrison finally did come on the line, he sounded pretty unconcerned. He didn't mention Ma's letter at all. Instead, he started telling her about a sensational new piece of evidence that he'd just found, which was a photograph that supposedly showed Oswald meeting with a CIA operative in Mexico City. Needless to say, Garrison never ended up producing this photograph, and nobody else has either. But this does seem to have been a standard opening move of his. He would try to disarm people or impress them by telling them that he'd just discovered some sensational new piece of evidence. On the phone to Sylvia Ma, Garrison rabbited on about this new piece of evidence for so long that Ma eventually had to interrupt him and ask him if he had received her letter yet. Garrison replied that yes, he had received and read the letter, and he told her that her points were well taken, but that she didn't need to worry about it because he'd just found new evidence in Oswald's notebook that proved that his code theory was dead right. He said that he had successfully decrypted 3 other numbers in Oswald's book using the same method, and they had turned out to be coded versions of Clay Shaw's telephone number, the number of the local FBI office, and the number of the local CIA office. As I've said, Sylvia Ma was no dummy, and she immediately spotted a flaw in this new theory of Garrison's. She told him that at least one of the numbers he'd just mentioned, the number of Oswald's local FBI office, would have been freely available in the white pages. Ma was well aware of Oswald's limitations as a mathematician. She knew that he'd had to break out a pad and a pencil to work out what 20 plus 20 was. So why would he have used an insanely complicated mathematical code to disguise phone numbers that he could easily have looked up in the white pages? Garrison replied with another quick explanation, as Ma later recalled. He said, according to Ma, that Oswald liked to play cops and robbers, or was it cloaks and daggers? Sylvia Ma was getting less and less impressed with Garrison as this phone call went on. She didn't like the way that he kept telling her that her points were, quote, well taken, when he clearly wasn't taking them, possibly because he just didn't want to. Ma was also troubled by a word that Garrison kept using as he tried to explain how Oswald's code had worked. The word he kept using was subjective. This was the same word that had troubled Edward Epstein when Garrison tried explaining the code to him. After the phone call with Garrison was over, Sylvia Ma wrote to a friend, quote, "I feel uneasy because Garrison said several times while he was giving me the data that there was an element of subjectivity. I think he meant on Oswald's part, but perhaps there is some subjectivity on his part too." That phone call was the beginning of the end for Sylvia Ma and Jim Garrison. The two Cyrillic Ds were like a little loose thread for Sylvia Ma that she couldn't leave alone. The more that she mentally picked and pulled at this thread, the quicker her faith in Garrison unravelled. Just 2 weeks after their unsatisfactory phone conversation, Ma wrote in a letter to her friend Harold Weisberg, "My position with respect to Jim Garrison is very simple. It is also final and not negotiable. I am ready to grant that his decoding was done in good faith, if without sufficient care and objectivity, but it is in error, for what he read as PO 19106 in Oswald's book is in fact DD 19106. The entire coding is therefore invalidated," Ma wrote. Worse still, Jim Garrison had acknowledged privately that Sylvia Ma was right. He had acknowledged that the letters in Oswald's book were not in fact the letters PO. But despite making that admission in private, Garrison still hadn't corrected his public claim that the entries in Shaw's book and Oswald's book were identical and that they could both be decoded to produce Jack Ruby's phone number. In other words, Ma wrote, Garrison is allowing a lie to stand on the record. I agree with most of what Sylvia Ma said about Jim Garrison in that letter, but I'm not sure about that last part. Ma said that Garrison was allowing a lie to stand on the record, and I'm not sure that lie is quite the right word. Garrison was certainly allowing an untruth to stand on the record, there's no doubt about that, but whether that untruth was a deliberate and conscious lie is a different question. I've always tried to be as accurate as I can be in this podcast, and I have to admit that I'm not entirely sure that liar is the best word to describe what Jim Garrison was. To qualify as a liar, you have to be fully aware of what the truth is, and you have to be fully aware that what you're saying is not the truth. And I'm really not confident that Jim Garrison was that normal. I think there was something deeper and more Trumpian going on with Garrison, which only an expert in mental illness could properly describe and diagnose. It was almost as if Garrison didn't care whether he was right or wrong, or didn't grasp that there's a fundamental difference between those two things. I also think it's possible that Garrison loved the sound of his own voice so much that sometimes he was able to convince himself with his own rhetoric. In other words, I think it's possible that he knew to begin with that Oswald's code wasn't real and that he'd made it up himself, but maybe in the process of trying to convince other people that the code was real, he somehow managed to convince himself that maybe there was something to the idea after all. This can sometimes happen with certain zealots and cult leaders. They start out as simple con men, but they end up being fervent believers in their own paranoid bullshit. It happened with the Reverend Jim Jones, for example, and there's some evidence that Donald Trump has a touch of this syndrome as well. And I think that Jim Garrison may have been at least partly like that. There's no doubt that he did frequently tell lies, but I think those lies were part of a deeper pathology. I think there was something distinctly not normal about the way Garrison conducted himself. Your classic liar is generally quite careful not to tell lies that can easily be disproved, but Garrison was almost suicidally reckless. He didn't seem to understand that if you keep saying totally false things in public that can easily be shown to be false, you're going to end up with a lot of egg on your face. Garrison knew that there were big problems with his code idea. Even some hardened conspiracy theorists had said that to him, and in certain moods he was even ready to admit it himself, and yet he continued to claim in public that Shaw and Oswald had used the same secret code, and that this proved that Shaw had conspired with Oswald to murder Kennedy. Exactly how mad or suicidal do you have to be to continue making such a serious claim in public when you've got good reason to know that it's not true, and when you know that any reporter or member of the public can quite easily check up on the truth of what you're saying? If Garrison was just a simple liar, and if he knew that his code idea was bogus, then he would surely have kept the details of how it allegedly worked to himself, and then would have just silently dropped the idea before the trial of Clay Shaw began. Instead, Garrison very proudly told reporters exactly how this supposed code of his worked, so that every Tom, Dick and Harry in the country could go and check for themselves how valid it really was. But to return to the story of Sylvia Meagher, for her it was beside the point whether Garrison was a liar or a lunatic. The bottom line for her was that when she had earnestly tried to warn Garrison that he was making a big mistake about the code, Garrison had chosen to ignore her. This caused Sylvia Meagher to become two things, like Al Pacino in The Insider, pissed off and curious. Meagher had stumbled on the two great dirty secrets of Garrison's investigation. He had a horribly loose attitude to the truth, and his ethics were non-existent. Sylvia Meagher wasn't the kind of person who was going to stay quiet about that. To begin with, she kept her complaints about Garrison in-house. That is, she only complained about him to other members of the conspiracy community. She tried to convince her friends in that community that Garrison was a false prophet. She told them that they were using double standards to judge him. She urged them to judge Garrison with the same scepticism that they'd applied to the Warren report. During one angry argument with one of her conspiratorial friends, Meagher said, "You're attacking the lies of the Spectors and Lieblers, but you're condoning the lies of Garrison." "What lies?" Meagher's friend replied. "He hasn't told any lies." And Meagher said, "Hasn't he? What about the foul fabrication of the telephone number code?" Sylvia Meagher was like a dog with a bone with that telephone number code. Once she'd got a hold of it, there was no way she was ever going to let it go. And the code thing caused her to start questioning all the other aspects of Garrison's investigation too. If he'd been so cavalier and subjective about this piece of evidence, then maybe he'd been cavalier and subjective about other things too. Maybe all his evidence was this weak. Maybe his whole case was nothing more than a bunch of meaningless coincidences that went nowhere. At around the same time that Meagher was starting to worry about these points, a reporter pressed Jim Garrison about the way that he seemed to be building his case out of coincidences rather than more solid pieces of evidence, and Garrison replied in a very interesting way.
Isn't this just a coincidence, however, rather than something more solid, like somebody who'll swear they've been seen together?
You say, is this coincidence? Any one of these factors of correlation could be coincidence, but the steady accumulation of them is not.
Unfortunately, Garrison didn't realise that he'd fallen into a well-known logical trap there. People like Garrison think that if you collect a whole bunch of flimsy pieces of evidence that look dubious in themselves and then bundle them together, the mere fact that you've now got a bundle of evidence means that you now have a strong case. But philosophers will tell you that that's a fallacy. If you bundle together a bunch of twigs, they don't magically turn into a solid log. They're still nothing but a bunch of twigs. Sylvia Meagher was coming to realise that that's all that Jim Garrison had. And just as her concerns about the foul fabrication of the telephone code were peaking, the press was starting to publish all those unflattering exposés of Garrison that I talked about in the previous episode. The first of those exposés was James Phelan's article in the Saturday Evening Post, the one that revealed that Garrison had used sodium pentothal and hypnosis in order to alter the testimony of Perry Russo. When that article appeared, Sylvia Meagher was ripe to believe the revelations in it. She was ripe to believe that Garrison's star witnesses, Perry Russo and Vernon Bundy, might be as full of shit as Garrison's telephone code was. Again, Meagher tried to make her fellow conspiracy theorists see the light on this point. She urged them to treat Garrison's star witnesses as skeptically as they'd treated the Warren Commission's star witnesses. When she tried this argument on the conspiracy theorist Vincent Salandria, Salandria rejected it, but he rejected it in a very interesting way. He told Meagher that the Warren Commission's star witnesses had, quote, provided lies which support a myth we know to be wrong, while Russo's and Bundy's assertions support what we have to know is close to the truth. I love that quote because it puts the hypocrisy and the circularity of conspiracy theory into a neat little nutshell. In Salandria's words, the official story about Kennedy's murder is a myth which we know to be wrong. And since Salandria somehow just knew that story was a myth, he no longer found it necessary to listen to any of the evidence that supported it. Since Oswald's guilt was obviously a myth, all the witnesses who said they'd seen a guy who looked exactly like him shoot the president or shoot J.D. Tippit just didn't need to be listened to. By the same token, Salandria somehow just knew that Jim Garrison's basic story wasn't a myth. In Salandria's immortal words, it was, quote, what we have to know is close to the truth. And this in turn meant that it was simply a waste of time to be sceptical about Garrison's witnesses. They may have been drug addicts and self-confessed fabulists, but because their stories jibed with Salandria's general sense of the truth, he wasn't about to waste his time wondering if they might be lying. To Sylvia Meagher's credit, she found that argument contemptible. She could see that it was just a fancy way of saying that the end justified the means. She didn't think that way, and she was ready to stop being friends with anybody else who did. But Meagher also had another, more personal reason for rejecting Jim Garrison's assassination theories and for getting very cross with anybody who agreed with them. Meagher believed that Lee Harvey Oswald was completely innocent. In her view, he was as pure as the driven snow. He'd had no involvement at all in Kennedy's murder and no knowledge at all of the plot behind it. He was a purely innocent fall guy. But if Garrison's telephone code theory was correct, if Oswald had an encrypted version of Jack Ruby's phone number in his notebook, that could only mean that Oswald was involved in the plot. For Sylvia Meagher, that suggestion was unacceptable. As she wrote to one of her former friends, I will not be a party to incriminating Oswald in the assassination on the lies and fabrications of the Warren Commission or on the lies and fabrications of Garrison, and I intend to speak out against both of them and against their supporters and collaborators. The conspiracy theorist Harold Weisberg, who was at this stage trying to manage the difficult feat of staying loyal to Jim Garrison while also remaining friends with Sylvia Meagher, told Meagher that she had nothing to worry about on this point. He told her that Garrison agreed with her. He too thought that Oswald was innocent. In a superficial sense, Weisberg was right. As we've seen, Garrison did often say in public that he believed Oswald was innocent. But Sylvia Meagher could see that Garrison's public proclamations on that point didn't make sense. You couldn't logically claim that Oswald was innocent and that he'd had a coded version of Jack Ruby's telephone number in his notebook. Garrison's code idea clearly suggested that Oswald was guilty, not innocent. As Meagher put it to Weisberg, Harold, how else can one interpret the Garrison allegations about PO 19106, with which he links Oswald personally, not a mock Oswald, to Shaw, whom he has accused? In other words, if you suggest that man A is guilty because he associated with man B, any idiot can see that you're also suggesting that man B is guilty. This was simple logic, and the fact that Sylvia Meagher could see this while other conspiracy theorists apparently couldn't, again underlines the point that not all conspiracy theorists are the same. Meagher had some seriously unrealistic beliefs, such as her belief that Oswald was innocent, but she hadn't lost her grip on the basic principles of logic. Garrison, on the other hand, apparently had. That was how far gone he now was. As Meagher wrote to Weisberg, "I am weary beyond words of explaining why I regard this man as a menace to legitimate criticism." As Sylvia Meagher drifted away from the conspiracy community over the issue of Garrison, Vincent Salandria made one last attempt to save his friendship with her. He wrote to her a letter that said, "Think over this proposition. After the Jim Garrison matter is over, win or lose, let's make up." Sylvia Meagher was incensed by Salandria's proposition. She wrote back to him, "You misunderstand me so persistently that I can only think that you don't wish to understand me. I don't look on the Jim Garrison matter as a game, a gamble, a sporting event, or as entertainment. After it is over, as you put it, the code will still be a clumsy and unconscionable fabrication, and I will still find it dismaying and frightening, as well as incomprehensible, that anyone who claims to be striving for truth and justice in the assassination could aid and abet a hysterical, unscrupulous half-wit like Garrison. This is no capricious personal tiff," she wrote, "to be erased by agreeing to kiss and make up. Please try to understand me this time, Vince. I am in dead earnest." So Sylvia Meagher stuck to her guns and severed her ties with every former friend of hers who refused to see her point about Jim Garrison. Her next step was to try to blow the whistle on Garrison in public. In September 1967, she wrote a letter to the New York Review of Books saying that, quote, "A critic of the Warren Report, it seems to me, is obliged to apply to Garrison's evidence the same strict and objective tests which he applied to the Commission's evidence." A couple of months later, Meagher's book, Accessories After the Fact, came out, and in the book's epilogue, she took her public criticism of Garrison even further. She called for a fresh official investigation into Kennedy's murder, but stressed that Garrison's investigation wasn't the sort of thing she had in mind. As the Garrison investigation continued to unfold, she wrote, "It gave cause for increasingly serious misgivings about the validity of his evidence, the credibility of his witnesses, and the scrupulousness of his methods." In November 1967, that was a pretty radical thing for a conspiracy believer like Sylvia Meagher to say. Other conspiracy theorists were not going to like her saying it, but Meagher wanted to get her concerns about Garrison on the record before Clay Shaw's trial could begin. In June 1968, she went even further and wrote a friendly letter to Shaw himself. She told him that she believed in his innocence and that she viewed Garrison as a dangerous demagogue and an unscrupulous charlatan. She told Shaw that, in her view, he was now being unjustly victimised in exactly the same way that Oswald had been. Meagher was, of course, only half right when she asserted that Clay Shaw was as innocent as Oswald had been, but at least she wasn't all wrong, like the people who believed that Oswald was innocent and Shaw was guilty. That was the upside-down world that Jim Garrison and many of his followers had chosen to live in, and there are still some die-hard Garrison fans today who continue to live in that world. So that's the story of Sylvia Meagher. Just by following the loose thread of Garrison's telephone code, Meagher wound up losing a lot of her old friends, and even ended up writing friendly letters to Clay Shaw. For another conspiracy theorist who offered his help to Garrison, it was a different telephone number that turned out to be the deal-breaker. In 1967, a young assassination buff named David Lifton joined Garrison's team as a volunteer researcher. Lifton would become briefly famous 14 years later in 1981 when he published a conspiratorial bestseller called Best Evidence, in which he argued that Kennedy's dead body was surgically altered before his autopsy so as to cover up evidence of a frontal shot from the grassy knoll. Lifton's obsession with the Kennedy assassination went back to 1964, when he was an engineering student at UCLA and Mark Lane came to the university to deliver his famous travelling lecture about Oswald's innocence. That lecture made such an impression on David Lifton that he ultimately dropped out of graduate school to become a full-time assassination researcher. When he offered his help to Jim Garrison in 1967, Garrison eagerly brought him on board. But it didn't take long for Lifton to become worried by some of Garrison's more paranoid antics. For example, every time some man carrying a briefcase walked past them, Garrison would turn to Lifton and whisper, "That's an FBI agent." Then there was the time that Garrison told Lifton about an exciting new link that he'd discovered between Oswald and Ruby. He said that there was a number on one of Jack Ruby's telephone bills that matched a phone number that he'd also found in Oswald's notebook. The number was PE81951. Here's some audio of a TV interview that Jim Garrison did at the time, where he explains this exciting new breakthrough to a reporter.
Let me first make a reference to Oswald's address book, which is in volume 16, and it's Commission Exhibit 18. Now, if you turn to page 40 in this volume, you will see the number written in Oswald's handwriting, PE81951. PE81951. If you go to XXV25, the Jack Ruby's phone calls, you will find that on June 10th, 1963, Jack Ruby called PE81951. That's the same phone number that Lee Oswald has in his address book, as printed in volume 16.
When Garrison told David Lifton about this supposedly smouldering new lead, Lifton went home and did what any half-decent Kennedy assassination researcher would have done. He looked up his copy of Warren Commission Exhibit 18, the notebook of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he found that Garrison was right. Oswald had indeed written down the number PE81951 in his notebook, but he'd also written down whose number it was. It was the number of a Fort Worth television station, KTVT Channel 11. Oswald's notation was correct. The number was indeed the phone number of that TV station. So as far as Lifton could see, Garrison's exciting new lead didn't mean all that much. So what if Oswald had the number of a Fort Worth TV station that had once been rung up by Jack Ruby? By itself, that meant nothing, unless Garrison had some other information about the number that he hadn't yet mentioned. So when Lifton saw Garrison the next day, he told him that he didn't quite see why Garrison was so excited about this new discovery. Here's how that conversation went, according to an account that Lifton wrote later. Quote, "I confronted Garrison with this the next day. He became very truculent and annoyed. 'David, stop arguing the defence,' he would say. 'But what does it mean, Jim?' I demanded. 'Is there someone at the TV station whom you can prove knew both men?' 'It means whatever the jury decides it means,' Garrison said. 'Law is not a science.' Finally," Lifton goes on, "I asked him, 'But what do you think, Jim? What is the truth of the matter?' His answer is one I will never forget," Lifton wrote. He said, with considerable annoyance and contempt, "After the fact, there is no truth. There is only what the jury decides. This turned out to be a watershed moment for David Lifton. He bailed out of Garrison's investigation shortly afterwards, and in June 1968, 8 months before the Shaw trial began, Lifton published an article about Garrison called "Is Jim Garrison Out of His Mind?" For David Lifton, the answer to that question was, unfortunately, yes. He wrote that Garrison was, quote, "a reckless, irrational, even paranoid demagogue who might seriously hurt innocent people before his investigation was done." Of course, Garrison had already hurt some innocent people, including David Ferry and Clay Shaw, but you can see what Lifton meant. And his article was yet another devastating takedown of Garrison by a former insider and friend. It's worth lingering for a moment on this conversation between David Lifton and Jim Garrison, because during it, Lifton asked Garrison what's really the money question about the whole Garrison investigation. He said, "What do you think, Jim? What is the truth of the matter?" And in reply, Garrison uttered the phrase that David Lifton said he would never forget. "There is no truth, there is only what the jury decides." I quoted this line in the previous episode of the podcast to illustrate the point that a lot of conspiracy theorists are essentially relativists who behave as if there's no such thing as objective truth. Some listeners found this suggestion a bit confusing, and I can see now that I didn't explain the point as clearly as I should have. On the face of it, it does seem quite odd to suggest that conspiracy theory has anything in common with relativism, because on the face of it, nobody is more certain than a conspiracy theorist is that there is such a thing as the objective truth and that they have it. Conspiracy theorists might reject official truths, but they do that only because they're dead sure that they're in possession of the real truth, which, of course, they'll be only too happy to tell you all about. So far, that doesn't sound very much like relativism. In fact, it sounds like the opposite of relativism. But the trouble is, conspiracy theorists are always wrong to think that they know the truth. They're wrong by definition. That's what a conspiracy theory is. It's a belief in a conspiracy that doesn't exist. But of course, conspiracy theorists almost never admit that they're wrong. They almost never give up on their false beliefs. This is another part of the definition of being a conspiracy theorist. And this is where conspiracy theory begins to slide into relativism. People who are as deeply committed to being wrong as Jim Garrison was often end up adopting relativism as a kind of fallback position. Garrison began by saying he was dead sure he knew what the truth was. He said that he had, quote, positively solved the assassination of President Kennedy, but he hadn't actually solved it. And instead of coming clean and admitting that, within a year he'd arrived at the fallback position of saying that there is no truth, there's only what a jury decides. Garrison's disciple, Oliver Stone, ended up saying something uncannily similar to that when he had run out of valid ways to defend his lying movie JFK. Stone ended up saying, quote, "Who owns reality? He who makes it up so that most everyone believes it. That person wins." When conspiracy theorists start saying things like that, they have completed the slide from conspiracy theory into relativism. They've gone from believing something that isn't true to believing that there's no such thing as truth at all. Rather than accept that they're wrong, they'd prefer to say that there's really no such thing as being right. If they can't have their toy, they don't see why anybody else should be allowed to have theirs. In fact, there's a point where extreme conspiracy theory moves beyond relativism and collapses into outright nihilism. If people like Jim Garrison can't prove their case the old-fashioned way, they end up trying to bring down the whole temple on everybody's heads, including their own. In the end, there really was a strong element of self-destruction and intellectual suicide in Jim Garrison's Kennedy obsession. He was ready to destroy his own reputation along with Clay Shaw's if he couldn't get the victory that he wanted. He threw Shaw onto the pyre, and then he jumped onto the flames himself. But not all conspiracy theorists are like that. Sylvia Meagher and David Lifton were not like that. They both had the integrity to be appalled by Garrison's cavalier attitude to the truth, and they both tried to blow the whistle on him in real time. They had no stomach for the kind of postmodern, post-truth brand of conspiracy theory that Garrison was selling. They were old-school, classic conspiracy theorists. They picked a position and they stuck to it, and their beliefs about the world had an old-fashioned logical structure in that they believed that one thing happened first and then another thing happened because of it, and so on. They didn't believe in Schrodinger's cat-style scenarios in which Oswald was somehow both guilty and innocent at once. But Jim Garrison was different. He loathed the official story so much that he was ready to believe any and every story that was not it, even if those alternative stories didn't cohere with each other. Garrison believed in the idea of conspiracy so passionately that he seemed capable of believing that many different incompatible conspiracies had somehow happened all at once. I know that sounds unlikely, but we've seen one example of this tendency of Garrison's already in the way that he never quite managed to straighten out his position on Oswald. If there was a conspiracy, was Oswald involved in it, or was he not? Did he fire all the shots, or some of the shots, or none of them? These are surely the first questions that any serious believer in conspiracy has to answer. In fact, if somebody who claims to be an assassination expert can't answer these questions for you in a straight way, I'd advise you to wrap up the conversation and walk away, because it's a surefire sign that the person you're talking to hasn't thought about the assassination in an even half-serious way. And Jim Garrison never did manage to give the world a straight answer to the Oswald question. At one point, he described Oswald as, quote, a participant, decoy, and patsy. How is that for a Schrodinger's cat scenario that falls apart as soon as you try to subject it to a moment's thought? If we believe in Occam's razor, we know that the simplest explanation of what happened in Dealey Plaza is probably the best. The simplest answer is that one bad man did it alone. Just because that answer is the simplest doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct, but there's nothing wrong with the explanation that Oswald did it alone. That explanation works, and despite years of effort, nobody has ever successfully been able to prove that there's any fatal flaw in it. But it's the mark of the intellectual ratbag in this case to just pretend that this simple explanation somehow just doesn't exist, that it just isn't there. That's what Jim Garrison did. In fact, he went even further. He didn't just behave as if the Oswald explanation didn't exist. He behaved as if Occam's razor itself didn't exist. He behaved as if complicated explanations were somehow better than simple ones. Instead of admitting that the assassination could be explained as the work of one bad man, Garrison blamed it on as many bad men as he could possibly imagine. The conspiracy in his head kept getting bigger and bigger as his investigation went on, and his claims about it kept shifting with the wind. In March 1967, just after he'd arrested Clay Shaw, Garrison announced that there had been 2 assassins. One of them was Oswald, shooting from the Texas Schoolbook Depository, and the other was an unidentified man on the grassy knoll. But not long after Garrison said that, the nation's leading conspiracy theorists started trooping down to New Orleans to help him out. One by one, they went down there and got in Garrison's ear, and as they did, Garrison kept adding all their various different pet theories to the great big conspiratorial stew that he was cooking up. For example, Harold Weisberg, the author of Whitewash, had a pet theory that Kennedy had been shot from the Daltex building, which was across the street from the book depository. Soon after Weisberg put that theory to Garrison, Garrison publicly announced that Kennedy had been shot from both the Daltex building and the grassy knoll, and that he now believed Oswald hadn't fired any shots from the depository after all. Then a conspiracy theorist named Ray Marcus showed Garrison some blown-up photographs taken at the moment of the assassination, which, according to Marcus, showed two figures with rifles standing behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. So Garrison now added those two shadowy gunmen to the running total of assassins that he had going.
We have even located photographs in which we have found the men behind the grassy knoll and the stone wall before they dropped completely out of sight. There were 5 of them, 3 behind the stone wall and 2 behind the grassy knoll, and they're not quite out of sight. And they've been located in other photographs by process of bringing them out, although they're not distinct enough you can make an identification from their faces.
So if anybody was keeping count at this point, it seemed that Garrison now believed that there had been 5 men positioned on the grassy knoll alone. Although at least 2 of those men hadn't fired any shots, their only job had been to catch the cartridge cases as they came flying out of the gunmen's rifles. This helped to explain why no cartridge cases were ever found on the grassy knoll, but it didn't explain why none of the bullets fired by these alleged gunmen was ever found inside Kennedy or Connolly or anywhere else. Anyway, if you added the 5 men on the knoll to the 2 gunmen that Garrison had already said were positioned behind Kennedy, that seemed to bring the grand total of active conspirators in Dealey Plaza to 7, and the number of angles that Kennedy was shot from to 3, or at least 3, as Garrison soon began to say.
This was the ambush that the president was in. He was shot from at least 3 different directions, which is perfectly obvious from the medical testimony.
The scenario in Garrison's head was starting to get out of hand, but he wasn't anywhere near being done yet. Shortly after he recorded that interview, the conspiracy theorist Jones Harris told Garrison about his pet theory, which had to do with a truck that was parked behind the picket fence on the knoll at the time of the shooting. When Harris showed Garrison a blown-up photograph of this sinister truck, Garrison promptly added 2 more men to the, quote, commando team that he now believed had ambushed Kennedy in Dealey Plaza. In September 1967, Garrison told Playboy magazine that Kennedy had in all probability been shot from 4 angles. Soon after that, he upped the ante yet again, and he started saying that Kennedy had been shot from at least 4 angles, and possibly 5.
By the time the president made his turn, the men who were to kill him were set to go. There had to be no less than 4 basic points from which the shooting occurred. There had to be no less than 4, and possibly 5.
As for the total number of men involved, by June 1967, Garrison's tally had reached 14. But even then he still wasn't done. Soon after announcing that the deed had been done by 14 men, Garrison fell under the spell of Professor Richard Popkin, the inventor of the second Oswald theory, at which point Garrison began saying that there had been 15 active conspirators in Dealey Plaza, one of them being a mysterious individual who was running around pretending to be Lee Harvey Oswald. Then Garrison fell under the spell of another nutcase named Alan Chapman, who believed that a gunman had been hiding out in the sewer system under Elm Street and had popped up out of a sewer manhole to take a pot shot at Kennedy's head. In December 1967, Garrison officially added this gun-toting Mr. Hankey figure to his running total of assassins. On national TV, he announced that he was now a firm believer in the theory of the manhole gunman. This now brought Garrison's grand total of active conspirators in Dealey Plaza to 16. And that was just the people on the ground. That was just the gunmen and the lookouts and the guys who were standing there to catch the cartridge cases as they came flying out of the rifles. The total got even larger when you added in the people behind the conspiracy, the ideas men who were pulling the strings of it. Garrison's views about who those string pullers were and what had motivated them also kept shifting with the wind. As we know, his original theory was that Kennedy's murder had been a homosexual thrill killing. The conspirators had all been gay, and they'd been acting out of gay motives. Soon enough, Garrison dropped that theory, and he started blaming the assassination instead on anti-Castro Cubans. After that, he went on to mention an almost endless array of other culprits, including Texan oil millionaires, the Minutemen, the Dallas police, the Dallas establishment, international arms dealers, the military-industrial complex, white Russians, and even Nazis. Having cycled through all those options, Garrison finally arrived at the last refuge of every modern conspiracy theorist. He started blaming the crime on the CIA.
Of course, the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency were involved in the murder of John Kennedy, just as they were involved in the escalation in Vietnam which followed.
You mean direct involvement?
Of course.
Why is it that conspiracy theorists in the Kennedy case always seem to end up blaming the CIA? It's a big question, but one short answer is that the CIA is a secret society, and conspiracy theorists have always been obsessed with secret societies. Most experts on conspiracy theory agree that modern conspiracy theory began after the French Revolution, when some very popular books appeared in Europe which argued that the revolution had been planned and executed by the two biggest secret societies in the world at that time, the Illuminati and the Freemasons. You don't hear too many Kennedy conspiracy theorists trying to blame the assassination on the Illuminati, at least not if they want to be taken seriously, but you do frequently hear them blaming the assassination on the CIA, which is the modern equivalent of the Illuminati. The whole job of the CIA is to keep secrets, and it rarely, if ever, confirms or denies anything that people say about it. In his book Reclaiming History, Vincent Bugliosi points out that conspiracy theorists in the Kennedy case are always campaigning for the CIA to declassify this or that file about the assassination, and the agency is always fighting them tooth and nail to resist this process. And whenever the agency resists the declassification of a file, the conspiracy theorists always assume that it's doing that because the file must contain the smoking gun about the CIA's involvement in the assassination. And then every time the file does finally get declassified, it always turns out to be innocuous. It turns out that the CIA has been resisting its declassification for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the assassination. As Bugliosi puts it, the CIA, quote, specializes in always acting guilty even when it isn't, and always being, from a public relations standpoint, its own worst enemy. Of course, the CIA sometimes is guilty, as Bugliosi concedes there. It has committed plenty of crimes and cover-ups in the past, and it has participated in some very real conspiracies. We know, for example, that it collaborated with the American Mafia on a series of harebrained plots to assassinate Fidel Castro in the early 60s. So when you add together those two elements, the CIA's commitment to secrecy and its track record of shady and illegal conduct, you can see why it's always been such a big and easy target for the Kennedy conspiracy theorists. Essentially, you can say whatever you like about the CIA's role in the assassination, and there's no risk that what you say will ever be disproved. Jim Garrison knew that, and he consciously exploited the opportunities that it gave him. Behind closed doors, Garrison freely admitted that he was blaming the assassination on the CIA because he knew he could say whatever he liked about the agency, and the agency was never going to answer him back. One of the people Garrison admitted this to was his chief investigator, William Gurvich, who wound up quitting from Garrison's team in mid-1967. The night after he quit, Gurvich went on TV to spill the beans about Garrison, and during that tell-all interview, Gurvich was specifically asked about Garrison's obsession with the CIA, and his answer to that question is still worth listening to.
Mr. Garrison said the CIA has attempted to block his investigation.
His purpose for bringing the CIA in, Bill, is this. As he put it, they can't afford to answer. He can say what he damn well pleases about that agency, and they'll never reply.
The defection of William Gurvich was just one of the many public relations disasters that Jim Garrison suffered in 1967. By the end of that year, he had been denounced as a liar, a demagogue, an opportunist, a charlatan, and a psychopath. And it wasn't just outsiders who were saying these things about him. They were being said by people who knew him well and had worked with him on his investigation. He's nuts, was how William Gurvich put it. So Garrison was in very deep trouble by the end of 1967. The trial of Clay Shaw was still many months away. In fact, it was more than a year away. And before Garrison could put his case in front of a jury, he was somehow going to have to repair the PR damage that had been done to him and get back on the front foot and push back against this growing perception that he was a dangerously irresponsible psycho. In January 1968, Garrison got his chance to do that. He was invited to appear on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Garrison would be the only guest on that night's show. The whole 90 minutes would be given over to a serious discussion of his case. Some of the NBC bigwigs wanted to put a lawyer on stage with Garrison and Carson so that their interview wouldn't cross any legal boundaries, but Johnny Carson nixed that idea. He said that he didn't want Garrison to feel that he was being ganged up on. So for 90 minutes, it would be just Johnny and Jim.
Would you welcome, please, Mr. James Garrison?
Well, thank you for inviting me, Johnny. It's an honor to be here. And I think your curiosity and your fairness are in the interest of the American people.
Carson's interview with Garrison wasn't the kind of Tonight Show interview you see today. Carson had prepared for it in a very careful way. He'd done his homework, he'd sat down and read the whole of the Warren report, and he'd read up on all the various public statements that Garrison had made about the case up until this point. Johnny Carson was ready to hold Jim Garrison's feet to the fire. He wasn't about to let him get away with any loose talk about the assassination on his show. Carson began the interview by listing just some of the wildly conflicting statements that Garrison had made about the assassination in the past.
A year ago, I believe it was, in February, you announced that you had solved the Kennedy assassination. I have no reason to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald killed anyone in Dallas. Then, in an AP interview in May, you said the president was killed by a bullet that was fired from the front. They had at least one man in the back who was shooting and another man engaged in a row in Daley Plaza in order to aid those with guns. From a television interview in May, there were 5 of them. 3 behind the stone wall and 2 behind the grassy knoll, and they're not quite out of sight. On the NBC show of July, you said the evidence indicates that he was shot at from 2 different directions in the rear and also from the right front. And then from the Playboy interview. You said, our office has developed evidence that the president was assassinated by a precision guerrilla team of at least 7 men. Isn't that terribly confusing? And don't you seem to be riding off in all directions?
That was a pretty strong opening from Johnny Carson, but Garrison seemed to be expecting that kind of question. He had an answer ready for it, and he clearly thought that his answer was very clever.
Let me see if I can put this in focus. If I were to say, for example, that an elephant has a tail, and he's gray, and he has 4 legs, it would be possible for somebody to point out You just finished saying an elephant had a tail. Now you say he has 4 legs, and now you say he's straight. The point I'm making is that each of these factors is a characteristic of one being, and in a complex situation like this, it's possible to be standing at a different point of view and describing different aspects.
It's always worth noticing just how serenely confident Jim Garrison managed to sound when he was talking pure horse shit, or in this case, complete elephant shit. Superficially, Garrison's elephant metaphor did seem to be valid. Just because he'd made various different claims about the size of the conspiracy, that didn't necessarily mean that his claims cancelled each other out. Because if you say that a conspiracy involved 3 men, and it then turns out that it involved 17 men, that doesn't mean that you were wrong to say that it involved 3 men, as long, of course, as those 3 men are still among the 17 that you're now talking about. The problem with Garrison's elephant analogy, though, is that it only works if the elephant you've been describing from various angles is a real thing, which everybody agrees is objectively there. Unfortunately, Garrison still hadn't provided a shred of evidence to show that the elephant he'd described in so many different ways had any existence at all beyond his descriptions of it. And he never would provide that evidence either. Looking back at Garrison's case now, 56 years later, we can safely say that the conspiracy he claimed to have detected simply wasn't real, whether it had 3 men in it or 17. The whole elephant was imaginary. It didn't exist outside Garrison's head. The passage of time has made this clear, but even in January 1968, there were already some very good reasons to believe that this was the case. Johnny Carson listed a few of these reasons during his interview with Garrison. For example, he pointed out that the sheer hugeness of the conspiracy that Garrison claimed to have discovered was in itself a good reason to doubt that he was right.
If you say there is a conspiracy, doesn't it have to be one amazing conspiracy, Mr. Garrison? I mean, if you say this is a conspiracy, doesn't this have to involve the CIA, elements of the Dallas police force, the doctors at Parkland, the doctors at Bethesda, the members of the Warren Commission themselves, the district attorney? Doesn't it have to involve all of these people?
Johnny Carson did a pretty good job there of articulating a simple common sense objection that you can raise against most modern conspiracy theories. The idea that Kennedy's murder had been planned and covered up by this amazing coalition of people and agencies was simply implausible on its face. No conspiracy even remotely like that had ever provably happened before in the whole of American history. Garrison was therefore making a very extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims are supposed to require extraordinary proof. But so far, Garrison hadn't even provided ordinary proof. Secrets in this country have not been well kept, Carson pointed out to Garrison. Things have a way of getting out any time more than 2 or 3 people know them. Again, that was a good common sense argument. Human beings are not good at keeping secrets. This is something that we all intuitively know to be true, and we should never be afraid of pointing to these well-known human truths as our first line of defence against conspiracy theory. Indeed, some would say that these simple common sense arguments are really the only arguments we need against conspiracy theory. Jim Garrison wanted America to believe that hundreds of people had participated in this conspiracy to kill Kennedy and that not one of these people had blabbed. But anyone who's spent more than a few hours living in a real human society will know that this suggestion is at the very least improbable and perhaps even impossible. Just by using his common sense, Johnny Carson had managed to get Garrison on the ropes by this point in the interview, and he was building up to a knockout finish. Garrison, he said, wanted America to believe that the Warren Report's version of the assassination was a fairy tale. But the story that Garrison wanted people to believe instead was clearly a much bigger fairy tale in every sense.
Could I ask you another question? The evidence against the commission, which you had nothing to do with and refute, I guess, almost in total, which you say, I think you said was a fairy tale, if I'm quoting you right.
That's conservative.
All right. You are asking us and the American public to believe that a team of 7 gunmen carried this out with precision, firing from various points that day in Dallas, and have disappeared in the thin air with no witnesses who ever saw any other gunmen, and a gigantic conspiracy in which nobody seems to have yet proved anything. You ask us to believe that. I find that a much larger fairy tale than to accept the findings of the preliminary report.
That was impressive stuff from Johnny Carson, and the point he made there was really impossible to answer. Jim Garrison answered it anyway by offering the stock response that he gave every time anybody got him on the ropes. He pointed out that the trial of Clay Shaw hadn't happened yet. When it did happen, he would be free to deliver all the evidence and the proof that people like Johnny Carson kept bugging him for, but until then, Garrison was legally prohibited from saying exactly what he knew. So people would just have to be patient and wait for the trial. Garrison had used this wait-and-see argument many times before. Here he is using it in another interview in the middle of 1967.
About the New Orleans part, I don't like to sound coy, but it is impossible to talk about the New Orleans details without touching somehow on the case, and I'm not going to take any chances about reflecting on Mr. Shaw or this case. We worked too hard for me to ruin it by a casual comment. If I knew the names of the individuals behind the grassy knoll, where we know they were, and the stone wall, I certainly would not tell you and couldn't hear. There is no question about the fact they were there. There's no question in our minds what the dominant race of these individuals was, and there's no question about the motive. In the course of time, we will have the names of every one of them.
On The Tonight Show, when Johnny Carson wondered if Garrison's case was nothing more than a giant fairy tale, Garrison responded with an even more aggressive version of his just you wait and see routine.
Well, let me reply to that I am not allowed as an attorney to come up with evidence until the case comes. I cannot make a statement which would reflect on Mr. Shaw. Since the day we charged him and arrested him, I have not made a statement which inferred that he's guilty, and I cannot infer that now. But I am trying to tell you that there is no question as a result of our investigation that an element of the Central Intelligence Agency of our country killed John Kennedy, and that the present administration is concealing the facts. There is no question about it at all.
That is your opinion?
No, it is not. I know it, and if you will just wait, you will see that history will support this as fact.
By January 1968, this was about the only good argument that Jim Garrison had left in his arsenal. The killer evidence is there, he said, but I'm not allowed to talk about it yet. So be patient and all will be revealed at the trial. Just you wait and see. History will record that everything I'm telling you here is a stone-cold fact. This argument was irrefutable in the sense that you couldn't prove on the spot that Garrison was talking through his hat, but he couldn't go on using this argument forever. Sooner or later, the trial of Clay Shaw was going to happen, and Garrison would have to put up or shut up, and everyone, including Garrison himself, would finally get to see what history would make of his case. And we'll be coming to that final chapter of the Garrison story next time on The Ghosts of Dallas.
We would like to hear from you exactly how you feel about facing this trial.
Well, gentlemen, with the help of my 3 attorneys, I have enough difficulty coping with reality these days. I cannot cope with rumor, after all. And God willing, yes, because it's in the hands of God always. No one knows what tomorrow holds for them. But I expect to stand trial, and I expect to win.